It started as a political whisper and then exploded into a full-blown alarm bell across Washington. Calls for Donald Trump's resignation, once considered unthinkable, are now being spoken aloud by lawmakers, media figures, and political operatives who believe the situation has crossed a dangerous threshold, and the question gripping the nation is no longer whether the pressure is real, but what happens next when a former president faces an unprecedented convergence of legal scrutiny, political backlash, and internal party tension that threatens to reshape American politics yet again. As headlines stack up and cable news chyrons flash nonstop updates, the resignation demands reflect something deeper than a single controversy. They signal a broader struggle over accountability, power, and a future of leadership in a hyperpolarized era where norms are constantly tested and rarely repaired. Lawmakers calling for Trump to step aside argue that the cumulative weight of investigations, court rulings, and public disclosures has created a scenario in which his continued presence on the political stage is, in their view, destabilizing not just to institutions, but to the Republican Party itself, which remains divided between loyalty to Trump's base and anxiety about electoral consequences. What makes this moment especially volatile is that it is unfolding against a backdrop of ongoing legal proceedings that are no longer abstract or distant, but immediate and consequential, involving courts, judges, timelines, and potential outcomes that could directly limit Trump's ability to campaign, govern, or even participate in political life as he once did. For supporters, these resignation calls are framed as a coordinated political attack, a desperate attempt by opponents to neutralize a figure they could not defeat at the ballot box, reinforcing a long-standing narrative of persecution that has only strengthened Trump's bond with his most loyal followers. For critics, however, the argument is far more urgent and severe. They contend that no individual, regardless of popularity or past office, can remain above the law, and that resignation, symbolic or otherwise, represents an acknowledgement that the system must come before the man. This clash of interpretations has turned every statement, every court filing, and every public appearance into a flashpoint, with lawmakers choosing sides not only based on evidence, but on political survival, donor pressure, and the ever-present influence of public opinion measured in polls, focus groups, and social media trends. Inside Congress, the dynamics are especially complex. As resignation demands do not emerge from a vacuum, they are shaped by internal calculations about upcoming elections, shifting voter coalitions, and fears that continued association with Trump could alienate moderates while energizing opponents. Some lawmakers see resignation calls as a moral stance, others as strategic positioning, and still others as a reluctant acknowledgement that the political cost of silence may soon outweigh the risk of speaking out. At the same time, Trump's response, or lack thereof, adds another layer of uncertainty because history shows that he rarely retreats under pressure, preferring instead to counterattack, reframe the narrative, and portray himself as the ultimate outsider battling a corrupt establishment. That instinct has served him well in the past, allowing him to turn scandals into rallies and investigations into fundraising tools, but critics argue that the current moment is fundamentally different, defined by legal constraints rather than media cycles, and by judicial authority rather than partisan spin. Resignation calls grow louder. They are increasingly tied to broader questions about governance and legitimacy. Can a political movement remain viable if its central figure is consumed by legal battles? Does refusing to step aside protect democratic choice, or does it undermine institutional stability? And perhaps most critically, what precedent is set if resignation is demanded or ignored under these circumstances? These questions are not merely theoretical. They influence how voters interpret leadership, how allies calculate risk, and how opponents plan their next moves. Coverage amplifies the stakes. often framing the story as a countdown, a tipping point, or a reckoning. Language that heightens public anxiety while reinforcing the sense that something irreversible may be approaching. Yet beneath the drama lies a more sobering reality. Resignation, whether formal or symbolic, is not a simple switch that resolves political conflict, but a catalyst that could trigger further division, legal escalation, or even consolidation of support depending on how it unfolds. For Trump, stepping aside could be seen by critics as accountability, but by supporters as betrayal or coercion, while refusing to do so may intensify legal risks and deepen fractures within his own party. For lawmakers demanding resignation, the gamble is equally high, as misjudging public sentiment could cost them primaries, endorsements, or political relevance in a landscape where loyalty is often rewarded more than dissent. As this pressure campaign unfolds, the nation is watching not just to see whether Trump resigns, something he has shown little inclination to do, but to understand what the escalation itself reveals about the current state of American democracy, where resignation is no longer merely a personal decision but a symbolic battleground over law, power, and the limits of political endurance. NCE setting the stage for a next chapter that could redefine the rules of engagement for years to come. If Part 1 exposed the pressure building around Donald Trump, Part 2 begins where the real tension lies, behind closed doors, where lawmakers, party strategists, donors, and power brokers are quietly gaming out scenarios they never expected to seriously consider, because the resignation calls are not just public statements, but signals of deeper fractures forming within the political machinery that once revolved effortlessly around Trump's dominance. What is happening now is less about dramatic speeches and more about private calculations, as Republican lawmakers in particular find themselves trapped between an energized base that still views Trump as indispensable and a growing sense among some insiders that his legal and political liabilities may be reaching a point of diminishing returns. These lawmakers are not simply reacting to headlines, they are studying polling data, fundraising numbers, voter enthusiasm metrics, and internal projections that paint an increasingly complicated picture of what continued alignment with Trump could mean for their own political futures. For years, loyalty to Trump functioned as a shield, protecting allies from primary challenges and ensuring access to his massive grassroots fundraising network. But the current moment has introduced a new variable, uncertainty about whether Trump can sustain that influence indefinitely while simultaneously navigating mounting legal constraints. This uncertainty has given rise to what some insiders describe as a slow-motion realignment, where public loyalty remains intact while private doubts grow louder and resignation calls, especially from a handful of high-profile lawmakers, serve as trial balloons testing how far dissent can go without triggering political annihilation. The Republican Party's leadership faces a particularly delicate balancing act because openly endorsing resignation risks alienating the party's most reliable voters, while dismissing the call's outright risks, reinforcing a narrative of denial that could prove costly in general elections. Meanwhile, Democrats pushing for Trump's resignation are operating under a different calculus altogether, viewing the moment as an opportunity to frame themselves as defenders of institutional integrity and the rule of law, even as they remain aware that excessive pressure could backfire by strengthening Trump's persecution narrative. This dynamic creates a feedback loop where every resignation demand fuels both sides. Critics see momentum, supporters see conspiracy, and the political temperature continues to rise. Adding to the volatility is the role of donors and major financial backers, many of whom wield enormous influence but prefer to stay out of the spotlight, quietly signaling concerns about electability and long-term brand damage while stopping short of publicly abandoning Trump. Their hesitation reflects a broader fear that moving too early or too visibly could fracture the coalition they depend on, Yet waiting too long could leave them tied to a figure whose legal battles dominate the campaign landscape. Media company. Verge further complicates the equation by amplifying resignation calls as breaking news, often framing them as evidence of imminent collapse, even when the reality inside party structures is far more cautious and incremental. Still, perception matters in politics, and the perception that Trump is increasingly isolated, even if only partially true, has a cascading effect, emboldening critics, unnerving allies, and shifting the tone of the national conversation from inevitability to vulnerability. Trump's own strategy in response to this evolving landscape has remained characteristically defiant, portraying resignation demands as proof that he is fighting entrenched forces on behalf of his supporters, a message that resonates deeply with voters who see him as a disruptor rather than a traditi. No politician. Yet even this strategy carries risks because defiance alone cannot neutralize court calendars, judicial decisions, or procedural constraints that operate independently of political theater. Lawmakers aware of these realities must weigh not only how Trump's rhetoric plays today, but how tangible legal developments could shape tomorrow's headlines, campaign schedules, and voter perceptions. The result is a party and a political system caught in a holding pattern, where few are willing to move first, but many are quietly preparing for multiple outcomes, including scenarios in which resignation becomes less a moral appeal and more a strategic necessity. What makes this moment particularly consequential is that it exposes a fundamental tension at the heart of modern American politics, the collision between personality-driven movements and institutional endurance. Trump's rise transformed loyalty into a currency and defiance into a virtue. But the current wave of resignation calls tests whether those values can withstand sustained legal and political pressure without exacting a cost on the broader system. As lawmakers continue to position themselves, their decisions will shape not only Trump's immediate future, but the rules governing dissent, accountability, and power within their parties. Because how this chapter ends, or refuses to end, will send a lasting signal about whether political survival depends more on unwavering allegiance or adaptive realism. For now, the resignation calls function less as an endpoint and more as a stress test, revealing who is willing to challenge the status quo, who prefers to wait it out, and who is quietly planning for a post-Trump landscape that still feels both inevitable and impossible at the same time, pushing the story toward an even more consequential question: what happens when pressure turns into action and hesitation is no longer an option? The moment pressure turns into consequence is when politics stops being the theoretical, and that is exactly where the Trump resignation debate now edges closer, because beyond the noise of lawmakers' statements and partisan reactions lies a far more concrete reality. The legal system does not pause for political strategy, and its slow, grinding movement may ultimately force decisions that rhetoric alone cannot delay. As resignation calls continue to circulate, they are NCR, easily tied to specific legal milestones, court hearings, rulings, deadlines, and procedural constraints that carry implications far beyond reputation or public opinion, raising the stakes from political discomfort to operational viability. Past controversies that Trump was able to outlast through sheer media dominance and base loyalty, the current legal landscape introduces limits that not be negotiated through rallies or reframed through social media alone, and this reality is reshaping how lawmakers, party leaders, and voters assess what happens next truly means. For lawmakers demanding resignation, the argument is shifting from moral outrage to pragmatic concern. They warn that ongoing legal entanglements could interfere with governance, campaign logistics, fundraising, compliance, and even ballot access, creating vulnerabilities that opponents could exploit with devastating efficiency. This argument resonates particularly with strategists who understand that elections are not won on defiance alone, but on infrastructure, timing, and credibility, all of which become harder to manage under sustained legal pressure. At the same time, Trump's legal team continues to pursue aggressive defense strategies, challenging jurisdiction, timelines, and interpretations of law, reinforcing his broader narrative that the system is being weaponized against him, a claim that energizes supporters but also deepens institutional confrontation. This legal-political collision has produced a paradox. Every advancement in a case strengthens calls for resignation among critics, while simultaneously reinforcing loyalty among supporters who see each development as confirmation of persecution. Lawmakers caught in the middle must decide whether to align themselves with a figure whose legal risks are no longer hypothetical, or to distance themselves in anticipation of outcomes they cannot control but must plan around. Media framing plays a decisive role here, often translating dense legal proceedings into simplified narratives of escalation or collapse, shaping public perception in ways that lawmakers cannot ignore, even when those narratives oversimplify complex judicial processes. Yet perception once again becomes a reality in politics, as voters internalize the idea that Trump's future may be constrained not by elections but by courtrooms, prompting questions about leadership continuity and movement sustainability. Within this environment, resignation is increasingly discussed not as capitulation, but as a pressure release valve, a way, at least in theory, to decouple Trump's personal legal battles from the broader political agenda he represents. Critics argue that stepping aside could allow the movement to survive without being overshadowed by legal drama. Supporters counter that removing Trump would hollow out the movement entirely, leaving behind a shell without its driving force. Disagreement exposes a deeper ideological divide about whether Trumpism is a transferable philosophy or an inseparable extension of Trump himself, a question that resignation calls force into the open. For Trump, the decision matrix is uniquely complex because a resignation, formal or symbolic, would not necessarily end legal scrutiny, but it would alter the political context in which that scrutiny unfolds, potentially reducing leverage while also reshaping public expectations. His historical pattern suggests resistance, escalation, and counteroffensive rather than withdrawal, but even that pattern faces limits when confronted with legal schedules that dictate where and when he must appear, what he can say, and how resources are allocated. Lawmakers watching these developments must consider not only how Trump's legal challenges affect him personally, but how they affect down-ballot races, party branding, and voter trust, particularly among independents and moderates who may be less tolerant of prolonged instability. This is where resignation calls on a strategic edge, functioning as warnings rather than ultimatums, signals that some believe the cost-benefit analysis is beginning to tilt in an unfavorable direction. Meanwhile, opponents see an opportunity to frame the situation as a test of democratic resilience, arguing that the rule of law must operate independently of political loyalty, and that resignation demands are a necessary answer of institutional boundaries. This framing seeks to elevate the issue beyond Trump himself, positioning it as a precedent-setting moment that will define how future leaders are held accountable. Yet the risk of backlash remains ever present, as aggressive pressure could reinforce polarization and deepen mistrust in institutions among large segments of the population. As these forces converge, the resignation debate evolves into something larger than a single decision, becoming a referendum on whether American politics can absorb sustained legal conflict without breaking into paralysis or permanent division. The coming phase, shaped by legal outcomes rather than press conferences, will test not just Trump's resilience, but the adaptability of the political system around him, determining whether resignation remains a symbolic demand or transforms into a practical inevitability driven by circumstances no amount of political will can override. pushing the nation closer to a decisive turning point that will redefine power, accountability, and the limits of endurance in modern political life. The final and most consequential question looming over this entire saga is not whether Donald Trump will resign, but what the aftermath would look like if he did, or if he defiantly refuses and forces the political system to adapt around him, because either outcome carries ripple effects that would reshape American politics long after the current headlines fade. If resignation were to occur, even symbolically, it would instantly trigger a scramble among allies, RIV, ALS, and institutions to redefine power centers, leadership legitimacy, and narrative control, transforming what began as a pressure campaign into a historic inflection point. Lawmakers who called for resignation would frame the moment as a victory for accountability and democratic norms, arguing that the system ultimately held firm, while Trump supporters would likely see it as evidence of coercion, betrayal, or systemic corruption, potentially radicalizing segments of the base rather than pacifying them. Such a scenario would raise urgent questions about succession within Trump-aligned politics. Who, if anyone, could inherit his influence, fundraising power, and emotional connection with voters? And whether the movement he built can survive without his constant presence at the center. Party strategists would face the immediate task of recalibrating messaging, deciding whether to distance themselves from Trump's legacy or selectively preserve elements of it that still resonate with voters, all while navigating a media environment eager to declare the end of an era or the beginning of a civil war within the party. At the same time, resignation would not erase Trump's legal shale, NGEs, but it would alter the political framing around them, potentially reducing their impact on electoral dynamics while intensifying debates about justice, precedent, and equal treatment under the law. On the other hand, if Trump refuses to resign and continues to confront pressure head-on, the system will be forced to normalize a reality in which a dominant political figure operates under constant legal scrutiny, testing whether voters, institutions, and parties can tolerate prolonged instability without disengaging or escalating conflict. In that scenario, lawmakers who demanded resignation risk being marginalized or punished by voters who interpret their actions as disloyal, while those who remain silent or supportive may find themselves tied to outcomes they cannot control. The refusal path also places immense strain on democratic norms, as courts, campaigns, and governing bodies are compelled to function in parallel with ongoing controversy, raising concerns about distraction, legitimacy, and institutional fatigue. For voters, the long-term impact may be even more profound, shaping perceptions of what leadership looks like in a system where endurance, defiance, and survival often appear to matter more than resolution or consensus. Younger voters and political newcomers may internalize the lesson that resignation is no longer a meaningful mechanism of accountability, while others may see the entire episode as proof that political power has become too personalized to be constrained by traditional norms. Internationally, allies and adversaries alike would interpret the outcome, resignation, or resistance, as a signal about the strength and flexibility of American democracy, influencing diplomatic relationships and global perceptions of stability. Media narratives would continue to play a decisive role, either memorializing resignation as a turning point or chronicling refusal as a prolonged standoff, shaping how future generations understand this period. Perhaps most importantly, the conclusion of this chapter will set a precedent that extends far beyond Trump himself, influencing how future leaders respond to scandal, legal jeopardy, and public pressure, and redefining the balance between personal ambition and institutional responsibility. If resignation becomes normalized under sustained pressure, it could strengthen accountability but also invite weaponization. If resistance prevails, it could embolden future figures to test limits with fewer restraints. For lawmakers, the story does not end with a decision. It continues in how they justify their actions to constituents, donors, and history, explaining whether they chose principle, pragmatism, or preservation. As the dust eventually settles, what remains will be a political landscape aired by the realization that resignation is no longer a quiet exit, but a seismic event, one that exposes fault lines in governance, loyalty, and public trust. Whether Trump steps aside or stands his ground, the outcome will not deliver closure so much as transformation, marking the end of one phase of American politics and the uncertain beginning of another, where the lessons learned from this moment will echo in campaigns, courtrooms, and congressional halls for years to come, answering the question of what happens next, not with a single event, but with a lasting redefinition of power itself.